Welcome to the podcast, Not Your Doc Anymore. I am your host, Daren Watts. Here we address the issues essential for your health and provide information to help you become your best advocate. We encourage empowerment through education. I cannot emphasize enough the power of those who understand clinical practice and science and are in the trenches on a regular basis and have had years of experience. Here to address the topic of science and discovery is Dr. Daren Watts and my brother. Gosh, I've been looking forward to this. I'm just going to read your bio real quick. Ryan received a bachelor's degree at the University of Utah in biology and was considering a life in medicine when he saw the life of his crazy brother as a resident in OB/GYN and chose to get a PhD in science. He received his PhD at Stanford University and completed that in a shockingly quick 3 years. He chose to forego getting a postdoc despite offers at various prestigious universities and went to work straight at Genentech. And at Genentech, he served as a director of the Department of Neuroscience. During his tenure there, he led the company's reentry into neuroscience. The Watts Laboratory focused on drug discovery for cancer and Alzheimer's disease, with an emphasis on understanding mechanisms of neurodegeneration guided by human genetics. After 11 years at Genentech, Ryan chose to break out on his own and start Denali Therapeutics, and I believe that was 10 years ago.
That's right.
Denali has advanced multiple therapeutic candidates into clinical testing for Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, and ALS. Denali has invented proprietary blood-brain barrier platform for delivery of therapeutic proteins to the brain. Ryan has also led efforts to raise significant capital to advance Denali's therapeutic pipeline, has been instrumental in forging partnerships to accelerate the discovery and development of medicines for neurodegeneration. Well, let's just talk real quick about this week or maybe month for Denali Therapeutics.
Yeah, Daren, great to be with you. Love you, brother.
Love you.
It's really, really good to be with you. I think it's actually miraculous to be together and thinking of the path here. And I think you were right. You were a big influence when I was a young child thinking about where to go and what to do next, fell in love with chemistry, thought medicine would be the path. And here we are now, 49 years later. Yeah. And it's been a very big week and year for us. And I think what's happened in the last several weeks is we've submitted our first application for a drug approval using one of the technologies we invented to get medicines into the brain. And so, as a scientist, you kind of dream of this idea of making medicines that actually transform lives, but you very rarely succeed. Actually, most often you don't.
Yeah.
As I saw you working enormous number of hours as a medical resident and thinking, really my wife was like, do you really want to do that? Do you really want to be a physician? Fell in love with science, fell in love with the lab, and kind of came to this realization that can still affect human health, but in a different way.
Yeah.
And trying to understand what's causing disease. But what I didn't realize is how hard it is to make medicines, how hard it is to invent, and the failures. And I think being the youngest of 7, you learn a little bit of resilience in your life. And I think that resilience has been key. But as you pointed out, this is a great week for us to have a podcast with the progress we've made over the last 10 years at Denali and now over the last 20 plus years as a scientist and drug developer.
That's great. How amazing that we can be together and do this on this week.
I agree.
It's great.
I agree.
The irony of all that is I think your wife saw how hard I was working, and now I think you work much harder than I work.
It's all relative. So where I work now, we have 3 different sites, 2 in the United States and 1 in Europe. And so a fair amount of travel, in fact, often like weekly travel. And you're right. I think what it was is I was working at Primary Children's Hospital. As you know, our mom was a volunteer at Primaries for 40 plus years. And I was a pediatric technician in surgery. So I spent 2 years while I was an undergraduate at the University of Utah in surgeries. And the great thing is every Monday, mom would be there wearing her pink and be in the front desk. And so we'd have lunch together every Monday. What happened, there was one weekend and I was taking call. This is like old school call where you have a pager and you get the trauma 1 alert. I'm an undergrad and preparing to go to medical school and seeing your life and Jenny and I were together, and it was a Saturday. We had a very specific situation where a young man had a gunshot wound, and we received this trauma one notification. And we were in the middle of something, and I'm like, honey, I have to go. And so I went, and we were actually in surgery for like 13 hours.
Wow.
And that surgery ended with that young boy passing away. And I came home, and I remember being just exhausted. And she's like, I don't think you should be a physician. And I thought, well, I love science and I love medicine. So what can you do? When you have a father who's an architect, brothers who are builders, a lawyer, an artist, a physician, you don't even think that a scientist is actually a job. Like it's not something I ever thought of growing up. And it wasn't that singular experience of losing that young boy on the table that changed my life. But I thought, what can I do that can maybe impact many people, but I'm not having those sort of one-on-one, or taking call. But you're right. Now it's like working 24/7.
You talking about the family. I have to tell you this quick story. When I was serving in my church in a calling that required me to work with a lot of young men, we had a night we call a career night. And I had Brent, one of our other brothers, who he referred to as an artist. I think it's a pretty loose term.
Yeah.
Anyway, Brent came and he showed all of his sketchbooks. If you've ever seen those, they're amazing.
Incredible.
He showed his Olympic medals there.
Yeah.
I don't know if he had the torch with him, all of which he designed for the 2002 Olympics here in Salt Lake. Then he just was talking about all the things he was doing. Well, one of the boys came home and told his parents, who I happened to see the next night. His dad said, hey, so gosh, my son was so impressed with your brother's presentation yesterday. Do you feel bad all the time? And I'm like, what do you mean feel bad? And he's like, well, do you feel bad that he's so accomplished? And I was like, well, I am a doctor.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I just hope that this parent doesn't now hear this story from my other brother.
Oh, yeah.
Now I'm feeling doubly bad is what I'm saying.
That's right. That's right. Well, it's when you're the youngest of 7 and there's 6 boys and everyone has gone on to do impactful things, there is like that intrinsic, let's call it family pressure. And you can do 2 things with it. You can choose to just do nothing and live off the success of your family, and or you can say, I need to do better or something different. I remember actually Dad would tell this, this a lot. And for some reason, I felt like being an architect would be a good thing. I actually really loved art in high school. And Dad used to say to me, and maybe he'd said the same thing to you, he's like, oh, you can do more. You can do more than that. And I just thought that Dad was incredible. Like, what more can I do? I see the homes that he designed and the beauty that he created. And I didn't ever really know what that meant. We're lucky. We have some pretty amazing brothers and an amazing sister, that's for sure.
That's right. We do. Before we get too much into this, who typically wins on the tennis court between the two of us?
Yeah, well, I think I maybe have tied once. I don't know if it was like 5-5 and like, oh, we got to go, but you definitely have. Ping pong I can dominate.
Yeah, you definitely do.
Yeah, but I don't know if that's something to be proud of. But tennis, I don't know if it's your top spin forehand or your one hand backhand, but you definitely have some. You're an amazing player.
There's something amazing about it. So Ryan is 8 years younger than I am.
Yep.
And for some reason on the tennis court, I just always felt like I would win. And even when I was down like 5-2,
that's right.
I thought, okay, I got him right where I want him. And anyway, for some reason,
I think that's exactly what happened. I remember being up 5-2. I had the same experience when I was working at Genentech. And because I was lucky enough to be raised by a father who was a collegiate tennis player and then taught all of us to play tennis, I'd go play tennis, but I'd play with all these VPs. And I'm like, I knew I was a better player, but somehow they had like mind control. And that's what you've always had in sports and in games, is incredible mind control.
That's funny.
Yeah.
Well, let's get into a few of these things. Thanks so much for taking us back. And we may have some moments of digression through this. The question that I need to ask is, why do you think we have so much distrust with the pharmaceutical industry?
Yeah, it's a great
start
question.
on that.
It's a great question. I start by telling people, I'm a scientist and I work in biotechnology. And our goal is to take severe diseases. Most of what we work on now are rare, even childhood diseases, which is kind of, ironic looking back in time, seeing that I worked at a children's hospital. I actually never thought we'd be working on childhood diseases. I always thought, as my career advanced, I'd work on Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. And the reality is that there are many diseases, especially genetic diseases, that need molecular medicines. And what I mean by that, they need medicines that are targeted to the cause of the disease. And it would be great if we could solve it by diet or we could solve it by lifestyle, but that's not the case for a number of diseases. And there's also diseases of aging that need molecular medicines. I think cancer is another great example where there are mutations in genes that lead to cancer. And if we can target those mutations, we can have an incredible response. But the challenge is that the pharmaceutical industry, as in other industries, as these industries grow, there are like really two ways to view it. One is profiting off people.
Yeah.
And the second is, a history, and it doesn't really take much. One or two bad actors or bad decisions where people feel like actually they're being taken advantage of. But the sad part about it is that modern medicines have such an incredible potential to transform lives, and yet they're now mired in a broader perception of what the pharmaceutical industry is trying to do and how it's really focused on rather than people's health and making money. What thing I actually noticed, or what I actually experienced, is that there are brilliant people in the pharmaceutical industry, absolutely brilliant, and people who are there to make medicines to help, to really solve really difficult diseases. And I think I was really lucky because I started my career at a company, Genentech, which is really famous for cloning human proteins. One of the first medicines they made was human insulin for type 1 diabetes. And, and we know that, obviously, it very well. And before that, we were purifying insulin from either cows or pigs, and it was highly immunogenic, meaning that it wasn't tolerated very well.
Right.
And we discovered this ability, and this was about the time I was born when Genentech was founded, this ability to basically define the code for a human gene and then make the human protein. Just super transformative.
Yeah.
And that discovery allowed these young individuals that get type 1 diabetes or a lot of the diseases we work on, these rare genetic diseases that are enzyme deficiencies, they're lacking an enzyme to basically make that enzyme and replace it. And to me, this is really inspiring. There's not really any other solution to go about it. And so I think that we have to understand within this sort of broader industry, great things are happening, and people who have a motivation to help human health are there. And I think as an industry, we need to step up and tell that story and have that focus. And I think you see pockets of that, and the vast majority of the pharmaceutical industry is doing what's right for human health. And I think at some point we could talk more about where there's been missteps, but we all know them because then that permeates the perception of society very rapidly. And then distrust is really easy to come by. Building trust takes time, but you can break trust almost instantly with a few, I think, not great actions. That's where I think what's happened, and that we can go across many industries that as they grow, there's some event that happens that then society questions, what is this industry actually doing? But I've been in it now in the biotechnology industry and colleagues in the pharmaceutical industry, and have been impressed with the level of rigor and science, and even taking what's discovered in academia and then turning it into a medicine. These things have to work. It's not a publication. It's actually you're running a clinical trial.
Yeah. Yeah. This may be a terrible question, but what percentage of drugs are actually cloned and then you're producing the gene for? Is that
it's
a
a
large
good
number?
It's a great question. In other words, if I were to restate the question, how many drugs are basically just replacing a missing human protein?
Yeah.
And there's the diseases we work on, there's over 70 rare diseases where there's an enzyme loss of function, but they're very rare. One of the lead programs we're working on in Hunter syndrome, 500 young boys in the entire United States. These are ultra rare diseases.
Wow.
But if you look at rare diseases in totality, they're no longer rare. So there's a subset. In fact, those are the highest probability diseases to work on because you know exactly what causes it
Right.
and how to replace it. But then you take much more complicated diseases, like many of the inflammatory diseases that we suffer from, atopic dermatitis, asthma. These are not single genes
Right.
that are causing it. And there you have to understand the molecular pathway. Even cancer, in some cases, there's single genes, but often it's multiple genes. And so in that case, what often happens is if something is going wrong, you can clone the gene that's going wrong, and then you can make a medicine that changes the function of that pathway. And that's the vast majority of medicines. They're not replacing missing proteins, but they're actually modifying pathways that have gone wrong in cancer and in inflammatory disease and in Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's. And that's actually much harder. It's a much more sort of trial and error scientific method approach.
Well, that's a perfect lead into the question that I need to ask. Will you discuss the current challenges of scientific discovery in the field of neuro-related illnesses?
Yeah. So my formal training is as a neuroscientist. So my PhD was trying to understand how the nervous system connects during development. And so I'm glad you're asking me the question of the challenges of scientific discovery, and I'll add discovering medicines in neurological diseases. And I think the challenge has been multiple fold. And I think the brain is a very unique organ from any other organ in the body. It's protected. It's protected from external factors. It has what's called a blood-brain barrier, which is an area that I've really focused my lab effort for years, which basically keeps most medicines out of the brain, keeps toxins out of the brain, keeps viruses out of the brain. And so a lot of times when we're inventing medicines, their inability to get access to the brain is one challenge. The second is just the absolute complexity of this human brain. You know, 1 billion cells and 1 trillion connections. And, you know, I think we still, as rapidly advancing as AI is, we still haven't come close to what the human brain can do, what your brain and my brain can do, and the ability to process information so rapidly. I think we hardly know how that goes wrong. And so you take the one end of the spectrum of complexity, which I'll say would be like neuropsychiatric diseases are so profoundly complex because they're either multigenic, meaning multiple genes playing a role, or they actually have no genetic underpinning and they're environmental, or their pharmacology can affect that. And so I think I actually was originally interested in neuroscience to understand psychiatric disease. Having read Man's Search for Meaning and the Power of the Human Mind, I felt like there's got to be a way. And frankly, I was discouraged. That it was so complex. If someone has depression, we have no biomarker to know their levels of serotonin or dopamine. And so midway through my training, when I was trained as a developmental neurobiologist and was thinking about becoming someone who invents medicines for neurological disease, I shifted to more molecular diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, which are still complex, but may have at least 1 or 2 or 3 causes as opposed to these very complex diseases. So the biological complexity is one of the great limitations in neurological disease right now. But that's where I think computational power and scientists are starting to unravel that complexity. They certainly are in the Alzheimer's and Parkinson's field. And just broad human genetics has been very powerful in that space.
Great answer. Will you discuss how new medications that are brought to the market and focus on rigorous testing and regulation that's required?
Yeah, and I think it's a great question because I think a lot of people, there are frustrations with access to medicines, cost of medicines. What I would love is for the world to understand how profoundly difficult it is to discover, develop, and ultimately deliver medicines to patients. And that difficulty comes at every level. The first is, are you even working on the right pathway? Is this actually the pathway that you want to regulate for this disease? And the more complex the disease, the more that's a question mark. And then when you invent the medicine, you have to test for its safety. And luckily, because of evolution, there is conserved mechanisms across mammals. So for example, you can test in a mouse or a rat or a dog or a monkey if a drug is safe. And that's actually regulated by federal government that you do this safety testing. And then you start your clinical testing in humans, and it can take years and years. I think on average for neurological medicines, it's at least 10 years,
Wow.
if not 15 years of testing to go from here's an idea, here's a pathway we want to modulate, to here's a potential medicine, including multiple stages of clinical testing. And I think it's done right. Generally speaking, it's very expensive. It takes an enormous amount of time. It's highly regulated, but that's because safety is the primary driver first. And then if it's working, it is often secondary. And then once you see it's working, then it's a miracle. I actually think medicines are like modern miracles because of so many ways you can fail.
It's great. I don't know if we had enough time to really talk about the scientific method and its role. Do you feel like we talked about that in developing new medicines?
I think it's probably worth just mentioning, like, what is the scientific method? And I think this also is important when we think about societal trust of science.
Yeah.
And I think as a scientist, what you realize that maybe people don't realize that haven't done experimental science is how truth evolves over time. And it's truly trial and error. And I think what you see is people believe, well, science must be truth. And actually, that's not always the case. Science is the best we know at that point in time. And then we get better tools to look at, like, we can look now into the human brain through imaging, or we get, I mean, think about it. It wasn't until 1953 that we understood the blueprint of basically all
DNA.
living things, which is
Sure.
DNA. We had
Sure.
no idea until 1953, and understanding that blueprint and how you and I as brothers, what we share a lot of the same blueprint, but we're not identical.
Yeah.
Right. And because we're not identical, these different genetic factors and environmental factors. And so I think what I hope people start to understand is that science builds on itself over time. The example that's given for most people is, or you think about, is the earth is flat. Because when you walk outside, it doesn't look like it's round to me. I mean, that's my observation. It isn't until you start making more and more observations. But let's face it, that wasn't even definitively proven until we sent people to space and you look at the earth and it's clearly round.
Yeah.
Right. And we thought that was the case. And maybe we learned because you could travel the entire earth and then suddenly you're back at the same point. That can only happen if it's round.
Yeah.
But it's actually really amazing how I think society expects that science is truth. And that's the goal, is to discover truth. And you can find these like little nuggets of truth. But then as tools get better and better, you learn more and more. And I love that about science. Actually, it's one of my favorite things about science is that it is constantly evolving and growing, and our knowledge base is constantly growing, especially when you're working on diseases of the brain. It's like, wow. I mean, I think back 15 years ago, how little we knew where we are today. So the scientific method is have a hypothesis, run an experiment, look at the evidence, and then iterate. Do it over and over and over again. And truth starts to reveal itself over time and is constantly revealing itself.
My follow-up question is just to hammer this down. What is the significance of evidence-based medicine in advancing health outcomes?
Yeah, it's such an incredible and important principle of what is evidence-based medicine. How are actual medicines that you're prescribed by your physician? How important are the trials that lead to the potential outcomes? And those outcomes then you essentially would predict could be a likely outcome for you. But, you know, as a physician who prescribes medicines, as you have been for years and years, and as a scientist who invents medicines, it's that data that you accumulate through those experiments. They're, of course, first in animal testing and then in human testing, that allows you to make a prediction. This patient comes in and they say, I have this and this and this. And you think, likely this medicine will help you. You're actually, every time you prescribe a medicine, you are running an experiment.
Right.
And that person takes the medicine and say, you know, it was great. It cleared it up. I'm fine. I think the great example of that would be antibiotics. I think what we may or may not appreciate is that the human lifespan has doubled since the discovery of vaccines and antibiotics. But those are pretty clear. I have this infection and that infection could kill me, But if I take this antibiotic, I can clear out the bacteria that would otherwise take over my body. Every time you prescribe a medicine, you're actually running an experiment.
Right.
And it's important as a patient, because not only are we scientists and physicians, but we're also patients, that we collect our data. When we take the medicine, we assess, has the fever dissipated, whatever it is, has my cough diminished? But going into that point, there's a lot of data that's generated to be able to approve that medicine. Now, there's also a lot of ideas out there, especially with social media.
For sure.
This medicine that was approved for this disease, well, it could potentially treat that disease. And I would just encourage everyone, you have information at your fingertip now. Just do some of your own research and say, what's the probability that this medicine that treats this, whatever it is, can actually also treat this disease? Physicians are great partners in this, but it's also challenging as a physician now. Because people will come in and say, well, I did my own research and I think this, and this.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, this doesn't quite make sense and this doesn't make sense. And if we look at the clinical data, so I think that all the data that leads up to the approval is important, but then that real world experience is also critically important as the medicine gets tested in more and more people.
For sure. There's a big thing in medicine, though, when you have medications that something happens, or you personally take medicine, something happens, what we refer to as anecdotal evidence,
Right.
which means that I've done it, I've done my own experiment, and this is what's happened. Now, there's a lot of different trials out there. There's anecdotal medicine, which is the very worst type of evidence. There's observational studies where we say we're looking at thousands of people, which I think what they're trying to figure out, what is the increased risk of autism?
Exactly.
Unfortunately, you're going to have to rely on a lot of observational studies. And then there's true clinical evidence-based medicine where you've got a randomized controlled trial. And I assume that's what you're in the middle of right now, or in multiple areas of your drug discovery. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. And that is the most rigorous. And the reason is that most of those trials are double-blinded. Right. And what that means, we think, okay, this medicine's been approved by the FDA, and not in all cases, depending on the disease and how linear or how obvious the cause is. But in many cases, you'll run a trial where you have both the patient and the physician are blinded to the medicine, right?
Yeah.
It's much more challenging in some ultra rare diseases, and especially diseases where you know what's causing the disease, to put someone on a placebo. In fact, some would argue it may even be unethical,
right? Because
you actually know what causes it, and you're replacing whatever it is, the protein, as we discussed earlier. But in a lot of cases, in huge disease areas like Alzheimer's disease, you need these double-blinded, placebo-controlled trials to have the most definitive evidence. And part of it is because we humans are intrinsically biased. We want to believe our hypothesis, and so you have to run this trial. And what I think people don't appreciate is that these sponsors, the large either pharmaceutical industry or biotechnology, don't actually run the trial. It's run by essentially a separate group. And many of the physicians are obviously in academic centers, and there are multiple layers of sort of separation in these very well-controlled trials. But that's, I think, the point, Daren, is that those are often the most powerful outcomes because they're established to have an unbiased look at, does this medicine actually help a patient?
I actually never knew that. Maybe let's talk about the stages of research and drug development. Can we maybe go into that detail? And I'm sure you know that by heart.
I do, and I fear at this point in the podcast, I don't want to put everyone to sleep, right? But I think the stages are, first, you have to have a hypothesis of what's causing this disease. You want to regulate a gene or a pathway.
Sure.
And then you basically make molecules that regulate that gene and pathway, and you test them in vitro, either in like a cell-based assay or an enzyme type assay. And then you start testing them in animal models. And this is the other thing that's just like so profoundly interesting, that part of the reason I absolutely love science is that we can often, not perfectly, and actually it's relatively imperfect, but we can model human disease in animals. For example, in mice, who we know their genetics, the vast majority of our genetic code is shared, even with something as simple as like a worm or a fly. But mice are even more similar to humans, and you can model these human diseases. They have very similar phenotypes. They have very similar deficits in these models. And then you test the molecule you made in those models to say, is it working? And then you test, is it safe? We'll call that area discovery and preclinical. And then the clinical testing, you always start with safety. So in humans, when you do your first testing, you're running.
You advanced your study from flies and worms and mice to a larger animal, or do you not need to before you go to clinical trial?
It's a big topic right now. And in fact, part of the new sort of FDA, is there a way we don't have to run either non-human primates or canine experiments? It's a question mark. But generally speaking, it's required.
It is.
You have to test. And the thing about it, it's the closer you get to humans, the more read through you have. So when you run an experiment, you're going to get more and more similar results as you get to the human study, right? So that's also, we'll put in that preclinical bucket. And you're asking two questions. Is it safe and does it work?
Yeah.
That's basically the entire drug development process. Is it safe and does it work? And there are many, many medicines that can be safe and only kind of work.
Right.
There are many medicines that work extraordinarily well, but are not very safe. I think cancer medicines are often that case because a cancer medicine is designed to kill cells, and sometimes it kills cells that you don't want to be killed. And that, I think chemotherapeutics are probably the best example of that. And then in human testing, people talk about phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, but the simplest way to think about it is safety first, early signs if it's working, and more safety, and then the ultimate experiment where you're saying, does it work? And is it safe in a broader population? That's essentially the process.
Awesome. Can you share some examples of recent breakthroughs in neuro-related treatments?
Yeah, I wish you were asking me about cancer and inflammation and even like obesity. I started my career in biotechnology right at the time that the first molecular targeted medicines for cancer were being developed. And it was extraordinary. Like HER2 and breast cancer, what was a really devastating outcome for patients. Now there's a very powerful set of medicines that can really, really target breast cancer. Neuro is not there yet, but it's getting closer. And I think maybe it's just being the youngest of 7. I want to take on the biggest challenge. And my colleagues I've worked with is, let's try to solve this.
Yeah.
And I think what you've seen in the last couple years, for the first time, of a few medicines approved in Alzheimer's disease. And I think what the world is worried about is, are they safe? Are they working? But these are driven by the era of molecular medicines, what we believe is the genetic cause of Alzheimer's disease and the ability to remove what's called amyloid plaque. I'm very excited about this class of medicines, but we have more work to do to fine tune those medicines to make them better. And I think the number one thing we have to do is we have to remove that amyloid before people start to have cognitive deficits, before they start to have memory challenges. Because I think by the time you have memory challenges, you already have 2 decades of that plaque formation. And so to me, that's probably one of the most exciting areas that will evolve is Alzheimer's disease. And then there are other diseases like ALS where there's some progress, at least to the genetic causes, that have been pretty compelling.
Is amyloid a byproduct produced in the brain?
Yeah. So the way I like to think about the brain is, because the brain is behind this barrier called the blood-brain barrier, much of what we produce at the cellular level has to have a unique way of being cleared through the brain.
Right.
And my favorite analogy right now is like the beachcomber. Seaweed washes up on the beach every night, and then you have a beachcomber go out and clear it out. And there are certain proteins that need this constant clearance from the brain. And anything that affects the ability to clear that protein will increase the risk of developing these plaques. These plaques don't exist in the cell. They exist outside the cell, these amyloid plaques. And the genetics is super compelling. And I'll give you one example. So we made a genetic discovery. This was a number of years ago. There's a very common gene that's a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. I carry that gene. It's ApoE4. And as you know, we have a mother who had Alzheimer's disease. And so likely mom carried that gene. And I discovered this. This is like a typical scientist date night. So I went on a date with my wife, and we decided to get genotyped in my own lab. It's kind of a fun story. And so we genotyped ourselves. And the reason we did it is because my wife's family has a history of Alzheimer's. This is before mom developed any cognitive deficits. And I was surprised to discover that I carried that mutation. And then, so what we did is we took that mutation. It's very common. 25% of the world's population carries this mutation. It increases the risk of Alzheimer's disease about threefold. So it's very significant. If you have 2 copies of the mutation, it increases your risk by 14-fold.
Wow.
So it's a very common variant. And what we did is we looked for individuals that were greater than 80 years old that carried this mutation in a gene. It's called ApoE4, and that were cognitively normal, and basically sequenced them. Did a huge sequencing experiment where we sequenced as many, and we actually did this in the Icelandic population, because there you can impute the genome of essentially all of Iceland. And this was a collaboration with a company called Decode Genetics. And what we discovered was a gene that protects people from developing Alzheimer's disease that carry this ApoE4. So in other words, they were normal, they were greater than 80, they should have Alzheimer's because they have this risk factor. And that gene pointed directly back to amyloid beta. In fact, it's the protein that when clipped creates this amyloid beta, or this seaweed in the brain that requires clearance every night or every day. And so I think genetically, it's very compelling. Where we've failed to be super definitive right now is a medicine that actually, as it removes amyloid, it basically halts disease. And I think probably the number one reason that hasn't happened yet, we now have medicines that remove amyloid. We're testing after the amyloid's accumulated for 20 years. And so we have to go and we have to look early before any cognitive deficits and remove that amyloid. And I think what you'll see is that it will be a long time before those individuals develop Alzheimer's. In fact, it could just halt basically the development of Alzheimer's if you get there early enough. And that's a lot like lipids in cardiovascular disease and LDL and decreased risk of cardiac disease based on regulating lipids. That's essentially kind of a similar situation in what you're seeing in Alzheimer's. So prevention is going to be the key.
You're running a company, and as you talk about these things, decades, sometimes,
right,
in your case, lucky 10 years. What is the cost of research and development that goes into this, Ryan?
And I think this is another question that I wish everyone in the world understood. I think if you're lucky, it will probably take you a minimum of 7 years and about $500 million to invent one medicine.
Wow.
But you fail. We've already had a dozen medicines that we've tested that we've decided we're not going to continue to test. So we obviously on those didn't spend that amount of money, but in Alzheimer's disease, it's at least a decade and at least $1 billion for one medicine. And the failure rate for drug development in Alzheimer's disease is 99, at least historically, it's about 99.7%. So we've spent many, many, many billions. And when I say we, I mean the industry has spent billions and billions of dollars trying to invent medicines to treat Alzheimer's disease. So it's extraordinarily time consuming. It's highly regulated. So every one of those steps we talked about, especially as you get into human testing, every step is approved by the federal government through the Food and Drug Administration, through the FDA, so that you can't just go and test people.
Right.
There are other industries like nutraceuticals that don't have that same regulation and also don't have the same regulation on claims. And so medicines have very strict regulation on testing, but also on the claims that you can make about the actual medicine. And I think that's probably good. It's keeping people safe.
Yeah.
I wish we could be more efficient. I wish we could do it faster and cheaper, but you need this evidence-based approach to look at outcomes and to do these placebo-controlled, double-blinded studies to really believe that your medicine is having an effect.
Yeah. Where does that money come from, Ryan?
Yeah, so it's a great question. Many different areas where the money comes from. In the discovery stage, and especially in like understanding mechanisms of disease, a lot of funding has come historically from the federal government.
Has it?
Like the NIH, and that's where we start to understand like the structure of DNA and structure of proteins that are in the cell.
Sure.
And then there is a business behind biotechnology, and there are different stages, right? There's a business ecosystem where some companies are fantastic at discovering medicines, and maybe they sell their discovered medicines to a larger company that would develop them. And then when they're successful, sometimes those companies are then acquired. And so it's the whole biotechnology, pharmaceutical industry that exists. And each stage creates more and more value. So discovery is the least value because it's the lowest probability that whatever your hypothesis is will actually be true.
Sure.
But as you've shown that your medicine is safe and that it's doing what you predicted, you've created a lot more value. And so that's how you create value throughout that system. And it's challenging. I mean, it's extraordinarily challenging. Just like any industry, it has its own challenges. But I think the timelines and the rigor required and the focus on safety, these are things that are really important, but also make it very expensive.
Yeah. As you were talking about Alzheimer's disease and the proteins and stuff, there were a lot of words that I wasn't quite sure. And normally in our podcast, I'll stop somebody and say, hey, will you define that? But there was probably about 20 different words that I think we may not fully understand. Our listeners won't.
Well, and I think that's the great thing about ChatGPT. You can just type in that word, or you can, send a text to Doc Watts, and I'd love to jump on the phone if you have. I'll tell you, as a drug developer, there are two things that I've loved more than anything. One is I will never refuse a phone call from someone who has someone they love that has, let's say, ALS or Parkinson's or Alzheimer's. And a lot of times those phone calls go, I'm sorry, there isn't really a good medicine.
Yeah.
And that to me is really discouraging. The second thing I've absolutely loved, and I didn't even know that this would happen, but we eventually have invented medicines and they're in testing and have met families that are on these medicines. And it's like these young patients that have these genetic diseases, and it's life-changing. I mean, it's life-changing as a drug developer to have that experience. And I think if I could have that over and over again, it's taken decades to get to that point.
Can you elaborate on the role of collaboration between scientists, institutions, and regulatory bodies and what that means?
Right. I'm going to go back, as I often do, talk about my own experience and talk about the value of collaboration. And I realized very early on when I was a graduate student, I was studying neurodevelopment and I was dissecting fruit fly brains. Okay. And I mean, you can imagine fruit flies are tiny. And so you use a microscope and you use forceps. And I was running a genetic screen trying to discover genes that regulate the wiring of the nervous system. Like, how does this nervous system actually connect? This is going to take me forever. I'm going to get my PhD in like 15 years. And so the very first thing we did is recruit 3 other undergrads that came in. And so the 4 of us would sit in front of these microscopes and dissect fruit fly brains for hours. And it was awesome. That was actually the first time I'm like, science is collaborative. It's fun. And I really loved working with these people. And I think that's where my love came of not just science, but the role of working with others to solve problems. It also increases the quality of your work. You're not this lone scientist who has a hypothesis that's trying to prove it by themselves, but working in teams. And then that really transitioned as I went into industry and worked on teams, first on cancer medicines, then on Alzheimer's medicines, and then on technologies to get across the blood-brain barrier. And in every circumstance, it was with these teams who were highly collaborative. And in industry, it was a collaboration with academic groups. And then you're collaborating with the FDA and regulatory bodies. And I think what you realize is that we are all humans trying to solve important problems. But it's even better if you enjoy the people you're working with in those collaborations. And back to the original point, I would still be in my PhD if I was dissecting those brains by myself.
Right.
And I think that the collaboration and working together, and then it's shared ownership, shared recognition for what you discover. And that's, of all the things that founding a company, I didn't found it alone. I have co-founders who are my closest friends, and they're like additional family members. And we fail together, we succeed together, we then find collaborators. And I think that's really important. I don't know, I feel like we live in a kind of disunified time, if I can use that terminology. And if humanity understand the power of unity, we would solve problems much faster. instead of being that person at the microscope alone.
That's great. Great answer, Ryan. Can you touch upon the challenges that researchers face, such as intellectual property theft or ethical considerations in clinical trials?
I think one of the things I've learned actually working with our other brother that you mentioned earlier, Brent, I learned very early on in business and then working with various different industries. I feel strongly that everyone should have a specific moral compass of integrity. And I think science and scientists are expected to be at that sort of highest level of integrity. And the challenge you have is that that's not the case throughout all industries, right?
Sure.
And I think it's so important to understand that it's not being sloppy and getting there fast, or it's not trying to find evidence that supports your hypothesis. Like, you should be okay that your hypothesis is wrong.
Sure.
And so I think that's the ethics of science. And the difference is, in our industry, that is then tested in humans. So that ethical standard needs to be as high as possible, right? And when it comes to intellectual property, that's how you protect those discoveries. That system, it's complicated when you look at it from a global perspective. But in general, I think the idea of filing patents and protecting your discoveries has been pretty effective.
Has it?
There are scientific stories where people like get teed off by some idea, or they get some insight, steal that idea, and go on and make another discovery, which are
Sure.
not great examples. But in general, I feel like the process of filing patents and protecting your intellectual property have been relatively effective.
And is that effective worldwide as well, right?
Yeah, it depends. It
Really?
depends from territory to territory. But the global economy is getting better and better at protecting intellectual property. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. What challenges has social media and the internet posed on spreading misinformation about neuro-related illnesses? And these are probably ones that are more recognizable, like Alzheimer's disease.
I mean, this is the most common conversation I have with someone. It's, I saw this on TikTok, or I saw this on Instagram. What do you think? And, as a scientist or as a physician, you get these questions all the time,
Yeah.
Daren. I'm sure you get them. I get them all the time. And I have a little bit of a nuanced way of responding to that, especially in the diseases I work on where there's not yet like super effective medicines. Usually I'm like, run the experiment.
Yeah.
Give it a go. If you think that,
Sure.
calcium from whatever C is going to help you, give it a go. And the interesting thing about neurological diseases is people talk about the placebo effect, and the placebo effect is real. The
Sure.
human mind has this ability, and even if it doesn't heal itself, its perception of its own health is so important, especially in like chronic pain and psychiatric diseases. There's a huge component of that. I'm not telling people to go experiment on everything. And I certainly I take a very skeptical eye, because these are not like evidence-based claims, whatever they are, either nutraceuticals or even like sleep and exercise and diet. But if I step back and try to be a unbiased, scientist, I think to myself, these things could work. They just haven't been tested, and so the question is, are you going to be someone who wants to test it, or do you want the evidence first before you try it? And I think things like lifestyle change, absolutely, go for it. Have a great diet, really prioritize sleep. In fact, there's a lot of data on sleep and amyloid accumulation in Alzheimer's disease. And I know a number of the scientists, it's really interesting work. And so often I'm like, sleep and exercise are probably going to be the most impactful prevention for Alzheimer's disease. And there are some studies, and these are like blinded studies in animals, maybe not as much in humans. So those are the type of things that I think are less risky. But then as you start thinking about repurposing medicines that are approved for other diseases and trying them in these diseases, I think one really important point is that I don't want to say all and be an absolutist, but the vast majority of medicines have adverse effects. There's things that, that medicines will do that are unintended. And not only that, they may be the exact mechanism. So you block that pathway.
Yeah.
And it's doing exactly what the medicine was invented to do, but then it puts you at higher risk of infection. And so you're taking this medicine for whatever longevity or for Alzheimer's disease, but you have these unintended consequences.
Yeah. Yeah. That's Great answer, Ryan. The only downside of that to running your own experiment is there is cost where you think, hey, it's great to have awareness on social media and internet, but there is a cost. And I guess my question is, how do we protect the consumer in those areas where you're not necessarily sure that there is the evidence?
Yeah, it's all a relative prioritization of where you want to put your own time and resources,
Sure.
right? And I think the challenge with human health, and you and I have discussed this at length, is that there are all these other things that matter in life, but if you're unhealthy, it's what matters most.
Right.
Right. I mean, it really has like that direct impact on you. And in that, let's call it desperation or that real unmet need, people are indeed willing to try almost anything. And that's where I think it's really sad. If the intent of whoever it is that's trying to tell you to take this is simply to make money and there's no evidence base behind it, you have to be aware of that. But you're prioritizing where you put your resources. And I think when people get to that point where health is the challenge, you will spend almost anything to be healthy. I think that's where the challenge lies.
Yeah. Tell me what you think the impact is of misinformation on public perception of science and medicine.
Yeah. What a question. And the interesting thing is, I don't know if you remember this. I mean, this makes me feel really old, but I'm not that old. Remember when we had like the encyclopedia down in the pit where we grew up, and I loved just randomly like pulling whatever, like the letter C or the letter G and pulling it out and like opening it up and starting to read about it. And it's like, that's how I'm learning. And then I go to school and I read. Now it's like amazing because information is just always there.
Right.
Always there in the form of mainly social media. And the news we get is not like traditional news. And we all know that news has its own bias as well. Right.
Yeah.
And what happens is, let's say that, for example, my knee is killing me or I have back pain. That's probably a good one, like, because it's happened before and I have back pain. So I just look up on the internet, or even I just type into Chat GPT, like, what's the most effective treatments for back pain? Suddenly that now streams through all aspects of the information I receive. I'm getting on Instagram ads. I'm getting ads when I open up to do my Gmail and I'm looking at Google, and then that algorithm feeds on itself. And suddenly I'm getting all of this information, but I'm suffering. So I want to try whatever it is. And I think we have to be extraordinarily careful to understand what is the intent of the person or the entity that's feeding you this information, right? Let's call it misinformation. We get back to this concept of truth and untruth. If the intent is to make money, you have to ask yourself, and in some cases it still may work, but you have to understand that intent. And so I think the challenge you have now is that everyone through Chat GPT and through Google are essentially physicians, lawyers, scientists, because they have all this information. And you go in there and we start to build that confidence, but recognize that it's not really the totality of information. I actually think the bigger issue is the distrust broadly that there are, let's say, very specific medicines that can be transformative in your life, but you have this misinformation, right? And I think we may not seek the best medical care because we're being fed this information.
Can you provide some tips for listeners to evaluate the credibility of their online information?
Yeah, I will say I'm probably not the best spouse or father. You don't want a scientist as a spouse. You don't want a scientist as a father, when my first approach to everything is to think initially it's not true. I'm like, oh, that can't be true. But then,
Is that because it's the scientific method?
That's right. Like, I want to know the evidence behind it. And maybe it's also just being highly skeptical.
Sure.
But I think it's okay. We should all ask ourselves when we're looking at information. I'm not encouraging everyone to be deeply skeptical, but step back and say, what's the evidence supporting this? And that's actually very hard sometimes to find that evidence. And there are broad medical claims and broad correlative studies, and you can get sucked into these and then just say, what's the evidence? Once you start asking that question, you realize that it's actually very difficult often to get to what's the original study? What does the data look like? And so I try to take a nuanced approach and say, well, if I look at what someone's trying to do and it doesn't look like it would be overtly harmful, besides maybe it costs money, then say, okay, give it a shot. Just ask the next question. That would be my advice.
So what educational resources are available to help you figure out, is there evidence?
Yeah. Well, I think this is part of the intent of a podcast like this, right? I think if we think about what Not Your Doc Anymore is trying to do, besides the miracle that you're here, okay, besides like the fact that you are here and have an opportunity to help people as you've done for years and years, when I look back and see the journey that you've been on, I think what you didn't experience when you were in the hospital in Germany is the people that loved you here. You knew that they were here, but you were there alone. And it was like thousands of people. And because those people have gone to you for medical care, they've gone to you for spiritual care, right? And I still think humanity is the resources. It's working with people that you trust, finding physicians that you trust, pausing for a moment with them and say, hey, I need your help, solving this problem. I need your help. To me, that's the most powerful, because it gets back to that question you had about collaboration. The journey is much better traveled with a group of people that you love. Be careful. Like, you don't find that in the internet. You don't find it in social media.
Okay, Ryan, what are the 5 key points that you would like listeners to know to help them better understand the science of neuro-related discovery, or just discovery?
Well, I think first, I'm a simple mind, so I believe everything is in 3s. I don't know if I have 5.
Okay.
Maybe I have 3. And I think probably point number 1 is that science is the pursuit of truth, meaning that often it lacks perfection, but it's a process. And over time, through evidence and evidence, we gain truth. What it requires, if possible, it's very hard for humans, is to try to be as unbiased as possible. So thinking as a scientist, it's like, this could be true, this might not be true. Let's run the experiment. Let's run the experiment and let that truth evolve. I think the second point, and I say this, and I'm in it, and I've lived it, and it's a reality, that real molecular medicines, that can really transform lives, like some of our cancer medicines that we have today, or some of the proteins we made, like human insulin or these enzymes, those medicines are very hard to discover and to validate. And when they are validated, they have often a lot of data behind them. And so we should seek really professional medical advice on what are those molecular medicines and how they can help you. And maybe the third point is, I would love to see a world where, not a world of skepticism, but a world where we dive a little bit deeper in our information, especially as it comes to human health as individuals. And think of yourself in some ways as an experimentalist. Like, you're going to try these things, you're going to collect the data, but also before you try, make sure you ask a little bit of a deeper question, find trusted sources, which is actually part of that challenge. Maybe that's my 3 points for today.
I like that. That's awesome. I know this, that people possessing the real knowledge of the current system are those that work within the system, not the ones that actually count the numbers. So if you could fix what people a lot to refer to as the broken healthcare system, what steps would you want to make to change the delivery of healthcare to patients?
Yeah, I mean, the most difficult question. I don't know if it is the single most difficult question facing humanity. And obviously it's like regional specific based on each country that has a different healthcare system. And it's overwhelming, actually, when you think about what is working and what isn't working. I do think the one advantage now is that information is available. So even though it may be misinformation, there is also a lot of great information that's available. But I think that interaction, the ability to access medical care is the one thing I think is absolutely central. Like the ability to speak with a physician, to understand how medicines are invented, developed, and tested, and the level of trust you should have in that medicine based on how rigorously it was developed, and take that view. And instead, it's like we are so flooded with misinformation that distrust breaks down the medical system. One other point, which is actually, I think, really important at this point in time, I do think prevention is key. I do think human health and taking your own health into your own accountability, your diet, your exercise, your sleep, all of that, but recognize that specialized physicians are an absolute essential.
Yeah.
And they're an essential because when there is a actual specific medical condition that you have, someone who has seen that hundreds of times, thousands of times, has such a unique experience versus what you think you have. And so we need a system where prevention and general care is the first line.
Yeah.
And specialty is the second. That specialty allows us to solve very specific questions. A good example is in cancer. You want to go to your oncologist that knows the molecular medicines and understands the current research that's being done with your type of tumor.
Yeah.
You're not going to solve it a different way. And so I think that that system needs to evolve where we have a focus on prevention and human health, but we have these specialists that solve those real medical challenges.
Love it. Thanks, Ryan. Yeah. I'm just going to leave this as our final charge, to use this knowledge to go forward and improve your health. If you are a healthcare provider, go forward with greater knowledge to deliver the best healthcare in one of the most vulnerable, essential interactions with those who are entrusted to your care. We must clarify that the advice that we give or the procedures that we have talked about don't substitute for your own professional medical consultation. In addition, listeners or viewers need to be aware of the limitations of the information that we've provided generally. I just want to be able to thank Laser Financial for giving us this great space to be able to meet today, and also the Andrew family, and especially Grant Heaton, who has been so gracious in directing the development of this episode. You can find this on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, and Not Your Doc Anymore on YouTube. You can also find us on Instagram and TikTok at NotYourDocPod or DocWatts_. Thank you for those also who made this possible. Natalie Watts, our president and CEO, and of Not Your Doc Anymore, LLC, our social media managers, Taylor Seberg, Emily Brown, Sarah Marion, and our production manager, Joshua Watts. Thanks so much.
Thank you, brother.